just a joy to be with you and to hear your heart to learn about mission and to go forth in mission together. And so I'm very honored to be up here. So just to fill you in on the past few months, I have found myself in a situation where I have learned far more than I ever wanted to about the effects of earthquakes. I have seen close-up shots of the damage that it's done to masonry, of the cracks that it's led to in our foundation, of broken beams that are hoisted high up in the air. And maybe most horrifyingly, I've seen the price tag that it will take for us to repair that damage at my parish. My church, the Cathedral Church of St. Luke and St. Paul, has been in this long-term, 10-plus year project of addressing these cumulative issues that our building has collected over the past couple centuries. But many of the flaws in our structure have the origin of this 7.3 magnitude earthquake that you're probably familiar with. It happened in 1886. At the time, the Post and Courier spoke of this earthquake as the most disastrous event in the city's history. Many city streets were blocked by strewn bricks, window sills, plaster, huge brick, stone pillars, and heavy beams. A seismologist at the University of South Carolina has said that at the time, over 80% of all stone or brick structures in the city were destroyed. Massive effects from this earthquake, and the cathedral was not immune. And though it's been 140 years almost next year since we have experienced this literal earthquake, and evidently, I have bad news for you this morning, we're due, I guess. As I was researching this, we have one on the horizon. But we still have not experienced any literal earthquakes in many of our living memories. But we have experienced one seismic shift in culture after another. Just even thinking about my adult life, some of you remember further back to that, but looking at the seismic shifts that we've experienced in the last 25 years, beginning with 9/11, happened my senior year, high school, and then the terrible wars that were brought about because of that in Iraq and Afghanistan, followed soon after by the 2008 financial crisis, and more recently, and probably most significantly, everything that we all collectively experienced together in 2020, with COVID-19, with the murder of George Floyd, with all of the responses to that, the protests and the riots, and then the election that year. And just as our parish in downtown Charleston is still experiencing the effects of that earthquake long ago, so our culture is in the midst of the upheaval. We're still experiencing the effects of the turmoil of the past 2 decades. Everything in our culture, it seems, has been shaken, and religion has not been immune. For most of my entire adult life, religion in America has seen nothing but decline, right? Beginning in the early aughts, you'll probably be familiar with this, there was the rise of this movement that was called New Atheists, or the New Atheism. People like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris kind of led the charge, ushering in, they thought, this new era of secularism that would eventually conquer and forever dispel all of the terrors that have been wrought upon our culture by religious belief. You've probably heard people talk about the rise of the nuns, those people who, when they get the government forms, choose to check nothing for religion, no religion in particular. Again, more recently in 2020, we saw this movement among young people. Some of you probably had conversations with your children or your grandchildren, and they described something they call deconstruction, right? Where they sought to separate and delineate their Christian faith from some of the more toxic expressions of it. And unfortunately, many people that began that journey of deconstruction, which was not all bad, there were good elements of it, but found themselves completely outside of the Christian faith. For the past few decades, we have thought, or maybe I've even assumed, that we would get to a place where we would be fully post-Christian. We would look at places like Europe and see our future. And for some, that was a cause of great rejoicing. For some, it was a cause of great sadness. But we find ourselves, and I find myself, in a moment of incredible surprise. Because this inevitable trajectory that I've experienced for the past 25 years, some of you have experienced it for even longer than that, this movement towards a secular, post-Christian society, even that has now been shaken. We're in this in-between space with the world that was, assuming that we would be moving towards a secular utopia, into this new world where there are cracks in that secular hypothesis. And out of those cracks, we're seeing small green shoots of faith and belief reemerge. And so in this in-between space, I don't know that anybody can actually say confidently what it will be on the other side of it. It's still very new. It's still very fresh. It's still very surprising to me what we've seen over the past few years. But what I'm going to argue this morning as we think about our culture, we think about our cultural moment, is that this space, even though we don't know the end of it, it does provide at least three very clear things. It provides for us a new clarity, right? It's a bit of an apocalypse. Apocalypse just means an unveiling, a revealing of what's actually there. And for many of us, the past few decades have unveiled what's actually there. Many of the authority structures, many of the leaders, many of the promises that have promoted so many good things have been exposed to not be what they seemed. So there's a new clarity on that. In this moment of upheaval and chaos, there also are new possibilities emerging, right? There's new worlds that are to be made. There's new movements that are emerging. There's new energy and fresh insight and fresh ideas that can be very exciting for some. But there are also new anxieties, right? There's new things to be afraid of. There's so much uncertainty. Just as there are possibilities that we don't know the end of, there are also things that could become terrible. Things could be bad. This new clarity has looked at all that's gone before, the culture, the authority, the structures, and have weighed them and found them to be wanting. And so we're seeing that disintegration in our politics, in our institutions, in our relationships, and in our faith. These new possibilities that are so exciting, these new worlds that could be on the other side, always seem to emerge from ashes. Think about what came out of Rome. New civilizations, a new Holy Roman Empire. New things to study, new ideas. Think about what's come more recently out of the world wars, the late 20th century. Exciting things with technology and development. But again, each of these has a dark side. After Rome came the Middle Ages. After the Reformation came the religious wars. After the world wars came the Cold War and the sexual revolution. After the shaking, we have new clarity, new possibility, and new anxiety. And I will tell you, honestly, that I have a sense of all three of these. I feel these all maybe simultaneously. Each day brings with it new clarity on things that were, new excitement and hope about what could be, but also a new sense of fear for what might come. The author of Hebrews reminds us, though, that this shaking is all at the hands of the Lord. He is not surprised by our transition from one world to the next. In chapter 11 of Hebrews, verse 27, he says, this phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of things that are shaken. That is, things that have been made, in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Though our world and our culture and even our faith can be shaken, friends, we are a part of a kingdom that cannot be shaken. G.K. Chesterton reminds us that Christendom, our faith, has had a series of revolutions, and in each of them, Christianity has died. Christianity has died many times and risen again, for it had a God who knew the way out of the grave. So because of the resurrection, because not even death has conquered our King, we can have hope in the midst of any situation. And so today, as we think about our cultural moment and what a potential and possible response would be, I want to give us three postures, three responses to this moment, this liminal and in-between space. And so to do that, if you brought a Bible, go ahead and turn to Acts 16. And we're going to use this as a grid, as a framework to think about this cultural moment. Acts 16, beginning at verse 25. In my Bible, it's on page 925, FYI. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. And the prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken. And immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's bonds were unfastened. When the jailer woke and saw that the prison doors were open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing that the prisoners had escaped. Paul and Silas find themselves in a moment of very literal shaking, a literal earthquake. The foundations of the prison are greatly shaken. And in that moment, you can assume that for each of them, there was a level of clarity, right? As their shackles fell off. A level of possibility, right? Paul and Silas are now freed to go and pursue their gospel work that has been given to them by the Holy Spirit. But there's also a sense of anxiety and fear, right? This jailer assumes that they've escaped, and he pulls his sword, and he is prepared to kill himself. Our current moment has also offered a similar clarity for all of us. Yet for many of our neighbors, this clarity has not brought with it just opportunity, but it's brought about great anxiety. I would say that this moment, and you probably would agree, this moment is marked by deep anxiety. If you were to describe our current culture in the West with one word, it might be anxious. We are a fearful, fearful people. In Luke 21, Jesus is talking about a moment whenever men's hearts, he says, will fail them for fear of what is coming upon the earth. That sounds familiar. As a reminder, Christians, while we may be afraid, while we may be anxious, that is not something we are allowed to cultivate. Marilyn Robinson, the essayist and novelist, in one of her essays says that fear is not a Christian habit of mind. It's not something that we rehearse again and again. The most repeated phrase, you've probably heard this, in the Old Testament is what? Fear not, for I am with you. Fear not. So we, friends, because we have a kingdom that cannot be shaken, because we can trust that the Lord is with us, we can respond not with anxiety, but with possibility. And Paul does just that. He looks at this jailer and he says to him, do not harm yourself. We are all here. And so I want to argue that the first posture that we need in this current cultural moment is a posture of compassion over combativeness. Compassion over combativeness. Paul certainly could have looked at this jailer and he could have said nothing. He could have said, go ahead, man. Have at it. You have brought this on yourself. Your gods and your military might have disappointed you. Your gods and your military might are actually enemies of the gospel that I preach, and so you deserve what's coming on you. How do you like them apples? Instead, what did Paul do? Paul responded with compassion. And I want to say today that it's possible and probably even likely that many of our neighbors look like our enemies. And it would be easy for us to look at them and view them as enemies of the gospel and to say, hey, you have brought this on yourself. Look what you did. You thought that ushering in secularism would bring about this utopia, but look what it's brought. We're more fractured than ever. We're more anxious than ever. We're more angry than ever. You took prayer out of schools. You brought about the sexual revolution. You started celebrating Pride Month. You deserve what's coming on you. But hear me out, friends. It is impossible for us to express the love of God that the bishop just talked about to people that we disdain, to people that we despise. And we will not reach our friends or our neighbors or our children or our grandchildren who think so differently than we do in this room with a spirit of combativeness. One of the most frequent emotions that the gospel writers use to describe Jesus is one of compassion, of pity. The Greek word that's used throughout the Gospels and Luke's Gospel, and you'll actually hear that read tomorrow if you're in the lectionary reading in Luke 16. The Greek word is spongnizomai, and the literal translation of that is that to be moved in the bowels. And so I wouldn't recommend talking to your neighbor and saying, hey, I was praying for you, and I was moved in the bowels on your behalf. That would not go over well. They might actually be combative in response. But what it literally means is that the heart, the emotions went out to them with pity and compassion. Jesus looked at the crowds, we're told in Matthew 10, and his response was not one of disdain or scoffing, as idolaters, as those who had broke the covenant of Yahweh, as those who would eventually reject him and yell out, crucify. We're told he saw the crowds and he had compassion. He had pity. He was moved. He saw that they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. So as followers of that shepherd, that Messiah, rather than combativeness, we can show compassion, even to those who appear to be our enemies, even those who look like Rome, just like the jailer did. Rome was described in Revelation as the whore of Babylon, right? He's an enemy of the gospel. And so whoever it is that you in your mind view as an enemy of the gospel, that is someone for whom Christ died. The secular college professor, or the atheist convert, or the Democrat, or the person with pronouns in their bio, or the trans person, or the gay person, any of those, whatever it is for you, those are people for whom Christ died, friends. When we lived on the east side neighborhood of Charleston, it's a very dense neighborhood, and so the houses are just like right next to each other. And so our kitchen window and living window just looked right out. I mean, not here to the piano, probably, to our neighbor's house. And we owned our house and lived there with our 3 children. And the house next door was a rental. And this one young person moved in, and we started noticing kind of with strange curiosity that every single night there was a new flag that was put up in the window. And one night it would be the kind of trans rights flag, and then one night it would be the rainbow flag, and then a very curious kind of combination. And I think it must have been homemade, because I've never seen these before, but it was actually a trans rights flag with the hammer and sickle of the Soviet Union. Doesn't even really make sense to me. But it was very clear that this person was sending a signal, like, this is who I am. This is my belief system. And so our kids began asking questions like, what does that mean? And so our kids who were like 3, 5, 7, 9, about those ages, between 3 and 9, we had a lot of really interesting conversations. But the dominant thing that we talked about is that these are people that Jesus loves. And we began praying for them every night. And over the course of 2 years, we had many opportunities to just show the love of Jesus to them in both subtle ways and maybe not so subtle ways. That's compassion. We didn't always do it right. We're not the heroes necessarily of that story, but that's the reality. My own dad became a Christian coming out of the upheaval of the 60s and 70s. He became a Christian in the midst of the Jesus movement. And if he had walked in the doors of this church, he would have looked like an enemy. He smelled bad. He was a hippie, long beard, long hair. But Jesus had compassion on him and wooed him to himself. And the church followed suit. There's a movie that came out a few years ago that I think has a beautiful picture of this. And the reason I was so keen to watch it, I don't generally recommend Christian movies, and so take this with a bit of a grain of salt, but it's called Jesus Revolution, and it tells the story about all of these hippies who've come to the end of a cultural moment, whose whole lives have been shattered by the sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And they're in the living room of this man named Chuck Smith, who was the founder of Calvary Chapel. And the movie does a beautiful job of showing this transition where he looks around at these hippies that are gathered in his room, his daughter being one of them, and he's looking at them with mocking and disdain, and something clicks. He looks at them with compassion. He sees that they are those for whom Christ died. And he begins doing everything he can to preach the gospel to them and point them to the hope that is in him. So that's our first call, a posture of compassion. Yet, of course, compassion can oftentimes be confused for being squishy, for just being loving, for just being affirming, for just being accepting. But here, Luke tells us that Paul does not lack for courage. That's our second posture, a posture of courage. We're told that the jailer rushed in. He's trembling. He fell down before Paul and Silas' feet, and he says to them, "Sirs, how may I be saved? What must I do to be saved?" And Paul and Silas don't say, "You're fine. We're glad you're okay. Just keep doing what you're doing." It's not a "I'm okay, you're okay" kind of response. They say very clearly and very boldly, "Believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved." In this moment, our neighbors and our friends need a clear and consistent conviction that Jesus is the one who saves. He's the beginning and the middle and the end of what we have to offer. And before we offer them our advice and our opinions, and we encourage them to just get their lives together or to begin growing in discipleship, we offer them first the gospel, the Savior, Jesus. But our neighbors also, I think, need the courage of life that's well lived, the courage to model a life that is submitted to Jesus. Our neighbors are longing, friends, for real things, for people whose lives are committed to truth and goodness and beauty. Because we're in a moment where everything is cracked, everything is collapsed. I talk to a lot of young people, and I will say that it's easy to criticize young people for what they are not doing or how they're not maybe stepping up in society in ways that maybe you did or your grandparents did or whatever. But they've inherited a world that is in ruins. They've inherited a world that's collapsed. We've not given them much, and they're longing to know how to live a good life, how to actually just be married and stay married, how to have a job and find dignity in that, and do good work, whether you're a surgeon or a teacher or a farmer or the person who collects the garbage. How to create a stable environment for children and family. That's part of why the rise of what you've probably heard this phrase, the manosphere. You all familiar with that phrase? The manosphere is this movement of mostly podcasters, but a lot of YouTube videos. Ask your grandchildren about it or your children about it, and they will certainly tell you about it. The most listened to podcaster in the whole world right now is Joe Rogan. And he talks a lot. He interviews a lot of people about the issue of discipline and structure and responsibility. And young men in particular are attracted to that. There's a psychologist named Jordan Peterson. Same thing. He wrote a book that was revolutionary because it said, "Wake up and make your bed every morning." People were like, "Oh my gosh, that is life-changing." But they're longing for stability and order and discipline and fitness. There's another version of that in this movement that's called trad wives. Again, ask your granddaughters about it. There's a whole movement on TikTok or on YouTube of these people, these influencers that live this life that's out kind of homesteading, out on the farm. There's a woman named Ballerina Farmer who lives with her 9 kids and her husband out in Utah and gives people this picture of a life that looks like life did 100 years ago, or at least our perception, kind of the glossed over version of a life that's very traditional. This is part of why there's a fresh appeal to Islam in the UK. In the UK, Islam is growing with young men, young Western men. Closer to home, there's been a pull towards Eastern Orthodoxy here in the United States for young men in particular. There's new attraction to the conservative movement. People are longing for order and goodness and truth and beauty. There was a young man that started coming to our church probably 2 years ago, and he just found me after church, and he said, hey, he was probably 25, and said, could we just get coffee? And he began to share his story, and he had come from a broken family, and in response to that, he joined the Marines. And when an injury forced him to retire from the Marines, he basically spent 2 years just in total deep, dark depression, alcoholism. And what began to kind of bring him out of that season was he became interested in meditation and psychedelics and so hallucinogens. And so he kind of went down that journey looking for something. He didn't know what, but he was looking for something. And he came to our church and he said, can we just sit and talk about Jesus? He had an awareness of Christianity and the gospel. He'd been to church. But what I found in my conversations with him, that yes, he was looking for the hope of the gospel, and he found it. He did. He began to be a follower of Jesus. through those conversations. But he was also looking for the order and the structure and the stability that was found in historic Christianity. So we were able to talk about some of the riches and resources that we have as Anglicans. We've got a rich heritage of things that bring order and structure and stability to our lives, right? We hear it in our liturgy. You'll hear that tonight and tomorrow. Our liturgy is filled with the gospel. It's filled with a good word to sinners, right? The comfortable words that the bishop just referenced. Come to me, all who are weary. God so loved the world. This saying is deserving of all and to be accepted, that Christ came to save sinners. If anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father. That is the essence of the gospel. But more than that, our prayer book tradition offers us something to order our lives by, with morning prayer and evening prayer. That was actually something that brought me into Anglicanism. My faith was in shambles, and finding the rhythms of the daily office brought structure and order to my life in a profound way. I know the bishop is particularly passionate about us being a people throughout our diocese that are truly and deeply committed to these riches that are ours as Anglicans. And our neighbors need that too. Our neighbors need that in our faith. A courage to have a message and a model of something that is a good life, submitted to Jesus. And I want you to say that we don't need to be perfect. You don't need to be perfect as you walk this out. But our neighbors need courageous witnesses in the simple, in the ordinary. Just husbands and wives who love each other, who love one woman for their entire life. Families that are stable and provide an environment for love and growth and discipline. People that have normal jobs, that go to church on Sundays. Those things have seemed so boring and mundane, but they're actually transformative in our moment. Ordinary faithfulness, ordinary courage to point to our neighbors. Finally, I'll make this point very quickly. Our neighbors have grown up in a world that is fractured and it's siloed. We have seen the disintegration of almost all of our institutions. We've seen this in our politics. We've seen this in our churches. We've seen this in our families. And everything in our moment wants to draw these stark lines between people, right? Between generations, boomers versus Gen X versus millennials versus Gen Z. In politics versus whatever your preferred flavor is. Every single thing in our culture is pulling us apart, and things like social media have just poured gasoline on that. And the church has mostly followed suit. The church has mostly gone along with that. In the 80s, the megachurches adopted something called the homogeneous unit principle, which basically meant that birds of a feather flock together. And so they said, we're going to target this particular person. We're going to target young families. And our entire church is going to be young families. The rest of them be damned. That's what we're focusing on. It had good intentions, but it just went right along with the cultural push towards homogeneity. Traditional churches have our own, maybe a little more highbrow version of that, based on music preferences most often. But what I want us to see is that Paul here, and Luke in writing this, emphasizes household faith. He emphasizes the denseness of this faith. It is not just the Philippian jailer who comes to faith in Jesus. It's his entire household. They go to his house and they begin to share the gospel with him. And the entire household believes. Of course, it was very common in this day for households to be multi-generational, all in one house. That's far less common in our day, obviously. But what I want to say is that our culture needs a faith and communities that transcend the siloization. I don't know if that's a word. Siloization. The fracturing. Our neighbors need communities that are thick, that are contrarian, that don't just go along with the other social norms and separations. This is what we see here with the jailer. An invitation to embody the life of Jesus into his family. This is what we see in the early church. The early church was a hodgepodge of Jews and Gentiles, of wealthy and poor, all together. All of Paul's letters, right, are written to mitigate these issues because they were such a mixed bag. And I don't know about you, but I look around at our church sometimes and I think, like, I would never be friends with you people. right? We're so different. Like, we are very different people, but somehow the gospel transcends all of that. And friends, our culture needs that kind of witness. One of my favorite things that my rector, Pete Dickinson, has fought for in our church is a multi-generational community. And it's been painful, and it's been awkward, it's been frustrating for me at times. But what we've seen is that when people come to our church, they always say, if they're older, they come in and say, we are amazed that there are young people here. If they're younger, they come in and they say, we're amazed that there are older people here. And then they go and they have dinners together. And it's so contrarian, right? Because very rarely, if you're not family, will you see someone in their 70s or 80s having dinner with someone in their 20s. It just doesn't happen in our society. But it's a powerful witness to our God. We need a faith that transcends individualization, and a faith that models contrarian community. And so we are going to have some Q&A at some point, I think after lunch. And so I hope this has stirred some questions or thoughts in you, but I just want to leave you with a couple of maybe things that we could do to cultivate these postures in our lives. Before we do that, though, I just want to just leave you with a question. As you think about our current cultural moment, what is it that you are most impressed by? What is it that you most sit with? Do you feel right now clarity about things? Do you feel like there's been a new kind of revealing of what's been or what is? And then are you feeling that as anxiety? I talk to a lot of people that feel this world changing around them, and there's a lot of anxiety. Are you feeling that anxiety? Or are you using it, do you feel opportunity? Are you feeling hopeful? And I would just encourage you that whatever you're feeling, just use that as an opportunity to turn it into prayer. Say, Lord, help me to view this as an opportunity for the gospel. Free me from fear. Free me from anxiety about this. And so as you seek to cultivate compassion, I think the best place to start there is just to pray, just to ask Jesus to give you his eyes to see people. People that look like enemies, see them as people for whom Christ died. And then the second one is I would encourage you to do this. And sometimes this is very hard because we, again, are very siloed, right? It's very easy to just be in Christian community all the time. But I would encourage you to talk to people who are not like you. Talk to people who don't know Jesus. Ask them questions. Strike up a conversation. I've been following this guy named Chris Arnott, who has been writing this blog for 2 years. He just travels around the world and just walks through cities. And what he does is he just finds the nearest McDonald's, the global kind of symbol of American power is in those golden arches. And he goes to McDonald's and he just sits with people and he just asks them questions. Tell me your story. How are you here? What's happening? I've been so inspired at the power of that, because you walk into a public space and what is everybody on? Including me. We're on our phones, right? We're disconnected. We're not there. Talk to someone. It's amazing how quickly our caricatures are dispelled and we can find ourselves having compassion for people. As you seek to cultivate courage, I would just give an appeal to our Anglican heritage, our traditions. Be rooted in the gospel as it's displayed in the prayer book. That happens through gathered worship, but it also happens in your day-to-day life, with your household, with your family, by committing to the daily office. Be rooted in that. That's how you'll be courageous, right? If you feel like you're deeply rooted and safe and secure in the gospel of Jesus. And then just be committed. I mean, you're here on a Saturday morning, so I trust that you are committed people, right? None of my people would come to a Saturday morning thing, so well done. Ordinary discipleship, ordinary faithfulness. That's actually courageous. And then finally, as you think about our neighbors who are in this fractured and siloed world, I encourage you to cultivate some contrarian community in some way, some shape, some form. Invite someone who's very different from you over for dinner. Host a dinner party with people from all different ages. We did this thing in our church that's really helped us grow in this called Dinners for Nine. And we encouraged our entire church to sign up to be a part of it. We had like 100 people that signed up. And then we broke them up into tables of 9, basically. And over the summer, they had 3 meals together. And I cannot tell you the profound fruit that came out of people being forced to sit together at a table and have really awkward conversations, right? Because an 80-year-old and a 25-year-old don't agree on too much. But they got to hear each other. They got to exchange ideas. And friends, that is a powerful apologetic to gospel that we propose to preach. We live in a world, friends, where all things are shaken, but we have a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And so it's our invitation to reflect that kingdom of compassion and courage and community to our neighbors. Amen.